I'm Julie, 28 female. I live in a quiet city apartment that I worked incredibly hard to afford, a little sanctuary of order and calm. As a financial analyst, my life revolves around numbers, spreadsheets, and predictable outcomes, a stark contrast to the chaotic, emotionally driven world of my family. For years, I was the reliable one, the emergency contact, the financial backstop, the one who always showed up. But one rainy Tuesday, I learned that a person can be an emergency contact for everyone else without having one for herself. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. In my family, love wasn't measured in hugs or I love yous. It was measured in transactions. Not always money, not at first, but in favors, in time, in sacrifices. And for as long as I could remember, I was the one making the deposits while my mother, Helen, and my younger brother, Mark, made the withdrawals. This was the unspoken contract we all operated under. I, Julie, the stable one with the good job, and the 400 one, Kay, would provide the safety net. In return, I received, well, the quiet satisfaction of knowing they were okay. Or so I told myself. My dad left when I was 16 and Mark was 14. He didn't just leave my mom, he left us, disappearing into a new life with a new family 2 states away. The financial and emotional fallout was immediate. My mom, Helen, who had been a stay-at-home parent, had to re-enter the workforce. She found a job as a librarian's assistant, a quiet role that suited her personality but barely paid the bills. The stress hardened her, turning her from a warm, affectionate mother into a woman perpetually worried, her conversations always circling back to money and what we lacked. I stepped up. I got a part-time job while in high school, and my paychecks went straight to household bills. When I went to college, I chose a state school I could afford with scholarships and more part-time work, majoring in finance because it felt like the most practical, most secure choice I could make. I was building a fortress, not just for myself but for them. Mark, on the other hand, went a different route. He was the artist, the dreamer. He saw my practicality as a limitation, a boring way to live. While I was balancing budgets, he was balancing melodies. He wanted to be a music producer, a dream my mom wholeheartedly endorsed. "He has a gift, Julie," she'd say, her voice soft with admiration. "We have to support his gift." Supporting his gift, I quickly learned, was my financial responsibility. It started small. $100 for a piece of software. A few hundred more for a special microphone. Then came the big asks. A new laptop powerful enough for music production, studio monitors, a top-of-the-line keyboard. I paid for it all. I told myself it was an investment in his future, a way of giving him the freedom I never had. The unspoken contract dictated that my responsible choices were meant to fund his irresponsible ones. When he was 23, he moved into his own apartment, a move I also subsidized for the first 6 months until he could get on his feet. He never quite did. His freelance work was sporadic, and he was always just one failed gig away from asking for help with rent. His girlfriend, Chloe, didn't help. A social media influencer whose entire life was a curated feed of brunches, trendy outfits, and sponsored vacations, she seemed to view me as Mark's personal ATM. She was perpetually cheerful and utterly oblivious to the cost of her lifestyle, a cost I was often indirectly bearing. When they went out for expensive dinners, it was often because I'd just sent Mark money for his groceries. When she showed off a new gadget on her Instagram story, I recognized it as the one Mark had told me he needed for a critical project. They were a team, a unit of consumption, and I was the silent, invisible benefactor. The unspoken contract had expanded. I wasn't just supporting my family, I was funding a lifestyle I couldn't even afford for myself. The annual family cabin trip was the pinnacle of this arrangement. It was a tradition started by my grandparents, a week-long getaway to a large rented cabin in the mountains. After they passed, I took over the financial burden. The cabin rental alone was thousands of dollars, not to mention the cost of food, gas, and activities for everyone. For the past 5 years, I had paid the entire deposit and the bulk of the final bill. My mom would chip in a couple of $100, a gesture that was more symbolic than helpful. Mark would promise to pay me back, a promise that evaporated the moment the trip was over. "It's for the family, Julie," my mom would say, as if that phrase magically absolved everyone of their financial obligations. "It's the one time a year we're all together." You can't put a price on that. But I could. I had the credit card statements to prove it. This year was supposed to be different. I had a conversation with them 2 months prior. I sat them down in my mom's living room, the air thick with the scent of old books and unspoken resentments. "I can't afford to cover the whole cabin trip this year," I said, my voice firmer than I felt. "The rental is over $3,000. We need to split it evenly." Mark scoffed, scrolling through his phone. "Easy for you to say, Jules. You're the one with the corporate job." "That's the point, Mark," I replied, trying to keep my frustration in check. "I work hard for that money. You and Chloe are both working. Mom has her job. We all need to contribute." Helen sighed, a theatrical display of maternal weariness. "Julie, don't be difficult. Mark is trying to build his career. Chloe's work is very demanding. You know I don't make much. It's always been you who handles this." "It's not about being difficult," I insisted. "It's about being fair." The word fair hung in the air, an alien concept in this room. After a tense back and forth, we reached a reluctant agreement. I would pay the initial $1,500 deposit to secure the booking, and they would each pay me their share of the total cost, around $800 each from Mark, Chloe, and Mom, before the trip. It felt like a small victory, a tiny crack in the foundation of the unspoken contract. I transferred the deposit money that night, a familiar knot of anxiety in my stomach. I wanted to believe them, to trust that this time would be different. But the history of our transactions suggested otherwise. The contract had always been one-sided, and I was naive to think one conversation could rewrite years of established terms. The patterns were too deep, the expectations too ingrained. They saw my resources as their resources, my stability as their safety. My role was fixed. I was the provider, the fixer, the ever-flowing spring of support. And a spring is never asked if it's running dry. It's just expected to keep giving. That was the foundation our family was built on, and it was about to be tested by a storm I never saw coming. The Tuesday it happened was relentlessly gray, the kind of day where the sky is a single, oppressive sheet of concrete. Rain fell in slick, steady waves, turning the highway into a treacherous ribbon of black glass. I was driving home from a late meeting with a client, my mind a blur of spreadsheets and market projections. The windshield wipers fought a losing battle against the downpour, their rhythmic thump a hypnotic counterpoint to the drone of the tires on wet asphalt. I was tired. Not just from the long day, but a deeper, more pervasive weariness from years of carrying a weight that wasn't entirely mine. I was thinking about the cabin trip, just 4 days away. No one had sent me their share of the money yet. A familiar pang of frustration tightened my chest. I made a mental note to send a group text reminder, bracing myself for the inevitable excuses. That was my last coherent thought before the world dissolved into a cacophony of screeching tires and shattering glass. A large SUV, hydroplaning across 3 lanes, slammed into my driver's side door. The impact was violent, a physical manifestation of a bomb going off. My small sedan spun like a top, the world outside my windows, a sickening, rain-streaked smear of headlights and blurred colors. There was a second impact, the rear of my car crumpling against the median, and then an abrupt, jarring stop. Silence descended, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the soft, insistent ticking of my hazard lights and the hiss of rain on hot metal. For a moment I just sat there, suspended in disbelief. My ears were ringing. A sharp, searing pain radiated from my left arm and ribs. I tasted blood. The smell of deployed airbags, a chalky, chemical scent, filled the small space. My car, my meticulously maintained, reliable little car, was a mangled wreck. The next hour was a disorienting haze of flashing lights, disembodied voices, and the careful, methodical movements of first responders. A paramedic with kind eyes and a calm voice leaned into my shattered window. "Ma'am, can you tell me your name?" "Julie," I whispered, the word feeling foreign in my own mouth. They carefully extracted me from the wreckage, strapping me onto a backboard as a precaution. The pain, which had been a distant hum, now roared to life, a white-hot fire consuming my left side. "We need to call your emergency contact," the paramedic said, holding up my phone, which they'd retrieved from my purse. The screen was miraculously intact. "Who should we call?" I gave them my mom's number first. She was always the primary contact. Then I gave them Mark's. They were my family. They were the ones you called in an emergency. As they loaded me into the ambulance, I heard one of the paramedics speaking into his radio, and then I heard him on my phone. "Mrs. Helen, this is Mike from the county EMS. Your daughter, Julie, has been in a car accident. We're taking her to St. Mary's Hospital. She's conscious, but she has some injuries." I couldn't hear my mom's reply, but I imagined her panic, her worry. I closed my eyes, clinging to the thought that she and Mark would be there soon, that they would rush to my side. That's what families did. The emergency room was a sterile, chaotic ballet of controlled panic. Nurses and doctors moved with practiced efficiency, their faces a mixture of focus and compassion. I was wheeled into a trauma bay, where the process of assessment began. My clothes were cut away, IV lines were inserted, and my body was poked, prodded, and scanned. The diagnosis came back within an hour. A fractured ulna in my left forearm, 3 cracked ribs, a moderate concussion, and a constellation of deep bruises that were already beginning to bloom in ugly shades of purple and blue across my torso. They put my arm in a temporary cast, gave me medication for the pain, and moved me to a small, private room to wait for observation. The adrenaline had long since worn off, leaving behind a profound, bone-deep ache and an unnerving sense of vulnerability. I lay in the stiff, scratchy hospital bed, the rhythmic beat of the heart monitor the only company I had. I kept looking at the door, expecting to see my mom's worried face or Mark's awkward, anxious one appear at any moment. Every footstep in the hallway made my heart leap with anticipation. An hour passed, then another. The room remained empty. The silence grew louder, more accusing. I asked a nurse if I could have my phone. She brought it to me, plugged into a charger she'd found. My hands trembled as I unlocked it. No missed calls, no text messages, nothing from my mom, nothing from Mark. A cold dread, colder than the sterile air of the room, began to creep into my veins. Had the paramedic even gotten through to them? Maybe they'd lost the number. Maybe they were stuck in traffic caused by my own accident. I clung to rational explanations, refusing to let the more painful possibility take root. I tried calling my mom. It went straight to voicemail. "Voicemail is full," a sterile electronic voice announced. I called Mark. "Ring, ring, ring," voicemail. "Hey, it's Mark, leave a message." I left a shaky one. "Mark, it's me, I'm at St. Mary's, I was in an accident, please call me back." I hung up, my throat tight. I stared at the door, at the phone, at the white ceiling, willing them to appear, to call, to show any sign that they knew or cared. But there was only silence. A deep, profound, and terrifying silence that told me I was utterly alone. The hours in that hospital room stretched into an eternity. Each beep of the monitor, each distant PA announcement, seemed to mock my solitude. The pain medication dulled the sharp edges of my physical injuries, but it couldn't touch the raw, gnawing ache of abandonment that was settling deep in my chest. Nurses came and went, checking my vitals, adjusting my IV, offering me water or weak tea. They were kind, professional, but their sympathetic glances only amplified my isolation. They all saw it, the girl in room 304, bruised and broken, with no one by her side. I kept my phone clutched in my good hand, its screen a blank, accusatory void. I refreshed my messages, checked my call log, cycled through the same empty notifications again and again. Nothing. It was as if I had ceased to exist the moment my car spun out of control. Around 10 p.m., nearly 5 hours after the crash, my thumb, acting of its own accord, opened my social media app. I don't know what I was looking for. A distraction, maybe. Or perhaps some subconscious part of me was searching for an explanation, any clue as to where my family could be. I scrolled mindlessly through the usual feed of baby pictures, political rants, and vacation photos. And then I saw it. It was a new post from Chloe, Mark's girlfriend, uploaded just an hour ago. The photo was bright, warm, and sickeningly cheerful. It showed a group of people clustered around a roaring bonfire, their faces illuminated by the dancing flames. They were all smiling, laughing, holding up beer bottles in a celebratory toast. In the center of the group, with his arm wrapped tightly around Chloe's shoulders, was my brother, Mark. His grin was wide, carefree, utterly untroubled. Behind them, I recognized the familiar rustic siding of the mountain cabin, the one we were supposed to go to in 4 days. The caption read, "Kicking off the cabin weekend early, road trip with the real crew, winking face cabin life mountain getaway, good vibes only." The air left my lungs in a single, painful rush. My vision tunneled, the edges blurring until the only thing in focus was that photograph. The real crew. The words echoed in the silent hospital room, each syllable a tiny, poisoned dart. There he was, my brother, not stuck in traffic, not with a dead phone. He was H. Hours away, in the mountains, starting their vacation without me. He hadn't just forgotten about me, he had actively chosen to leave, to go on this trip knowing I was supposed to be there, knowing we had planned it for months. The timeline clicked into place with sickening clarity. The paramedic had called him around 5:30 p.m. He posted this photo around 9 p.m. in the intervening hours. He hadn't rushed to the hospital. He had packed a bag, gotten in a car with his girlfriend and friends, and driven 3 hours north. He had made a choice. They had all made a choice. My phone slipped from my numb fingers and clattered onto the linoleum floor. I didn't have the strength to pick it up. I just stared at the wall, the image of their smiling faces burned onto the back of my eyelids. The betrayal was so profound, so complete, it felt like a physical blow, more painful than the impact of the SUV. It wasn't just that they didn't show up. It was the reason why. They weren't there for my worst moment because they were too busy creating their own best moment, a moment from which I was deliberately excluded. A cold, hard anger began to form in the pit of my stomach. It was different from the frustration I usually felt with my family. This was a clean, pure rage. It burned away the fog of pain and confusion, leaving behind a sharp, crystalline certainty. The unspoken contract was not just breached, it had been shredded, set on fire, and scattered to the wind. For years, I had poured my time, my energy, and my money into a family that, at the first sign of real trouble, had left me bleeding on the side of a highway without a second thought. I had been their safety net, but when I was the one falling, I discovered there was nothing beneath me at all. I thought about the money. The $1,500 deposit I had paid for that very cabin, for that very bonfire they were enjoying. The thousands of dollars over the years for Mark's equipment, his rent, my mom's bills. It had never been a loan, never an investment. It had been a tax for being the responsible one. A tax for loving people who were incapable of loving me back in any meaningful way. A nurse came in to check on me. "Everything okay, sweetie?" she asked, her voice gentle. She saw the tears streaming silently down my face. I couldn't speak. I could only shake my head. She must have assumed it was from the pain of my injuries. She adjusted my pain medication, her touch soft and comforting. But the source of my agony was something no medicine could cure. I spent the rest of the night in a state of suspended animation, my mind replaying that photo over and over again. Mark's laughing face. Chloe's perfect smile. The hashtag good vibes only. They were having a great time, and why wouldn't they be? The trip was on me. Their good vibes were funded by my hard work, their carefree weekend made possible by my sacrifice. And in their world, the person who paid the bills didn't need to be present for the party to start. She just needed to pay. I didn't sleep. I lay awake in the dark, listening to the steady beep of the monitor, a mechanical heartbeat in a room devoid of any human warmth. By the time the first gray light of dawn began to filter through the window, the hurt had begun to crystallize into something else. Something hard, cold, and resolute. I was done. I was done being the safety net. I was done being the provider. And I was done paying for a family that didn't exist. I was discharged from the hospital late the next day. The doctor gave me a prescription for painkillers, a sling for my arm, and strict instructions to rest. My best friend, Sarah, was the one who came to pick me up. I had called her that morning, my voice hoarse and shaky. When she arrived, she didn't just bring a car. She brought pillows, a blanket, a bag of my favorite snacks, and a thermos of hot tea. She took one look at my bandaged, bruised state and her face, usually so cheerful, hardened with protective anger. "Where are they, Julie?" she asked, her voice low and tight. She didn't need to say who they were. I just shook my head, unable to form the words. She didn't press. She helped me into her car as if I were made of glass, and on the quiet drive to my apartment, I finally told her everything. I showed her Chloe's post. She stared at the phone, her knuckles white as she gripped the steering wheel. "I'm going to kill him," she muttered. "No," I said, and the word came out surprisingly firm. "Don't, I have a better idea." The next 3 days were a blur of pain, exhaustion, and simmering rage. My apartment, once my sanctuary, felt like a prison. Every movement was an effort. Simple tasks like making toast or brushing my teeth became Herculean feats. My body was a constant, aching reminder of the crash, but my physical pain was dwarfed by the emotional turmoil. My phone remained silent, not a single call or text from Mark or my mother. It was a silence so complete, so absolute, it was its own Orm of communication. It told me they weren't sorry. They weren't worried. They likely hadn't even thought of me. They were up in the mountains, living it up on my dime, without a single backward glance. I imagined them hiking, drinking, laughing around the bonfire, their conversations blissfully free of any concern for the family member lying broken in a hospital bed. The thought was a whetstone, sharpening my anger to a razor's edge. I focused on what I could control. I called my insurance company and started the claim process for my car, which was totaled. I called my office and arranged for a medical leave. I methodically took care of the administrative aftermath of the disaster, my financial analyst brain finding a strange comfort in the order of tasks and paperwork. It was a distraction from the larger, messier disaster of my family. On Friday morning, 4 days after the crash, my phone, which had been a dead weight in my apartment, suddenly lit up like a Christmas tree. It buzzed and chimed relentlessly, a sudden, violent intrusion into my quiet convalescence. I looked at the screen. 41 missed calls, 20 from Mark, 21 from my mother. They had come in rapid succession over the past hour. My heart began to pound, a frantic, panicked rhythm against my cracked ribs. What could possibly be so urgent? Had something happened to them? For a fleeting, foolish moment, a flicker of my old, conditioned worry sparked to life. Then, a new notification popped up at the top of my screen. It wasn't a text message. It was from an app I rarely used with them. Venmo, Mark has requested $3,100. The note attached was brief, almost comically nonchalant. Cabin weekend, everyone's chipping in. I stared at the screen, my mind struggling to process the sheer, unmitigated audacity. He wanted $3,100, after abandoning me in a hospital, after ignoring me for 4 days, after starting the vacation, which I had already partially paid for, without me. He was now demanding money for the very trip he had chosen over my well-being. It wasn't a request, it was a bill. A bill for services not rendered. A bill for a party I wasn't invited to. The rage that had been simmering for days boiled over. It was so intense, so pure, it felt like it might actually burn through my veins. It was the audacity that broke me. The complete lack of shame, the utter disconnect from reality. In their minds, I was not a person who had just survived a traumatic event. I was not their sister or their daughter. I was a financial entity, a line of credit that had temporarily gone offline. Now they needed it back online to settle their accounts. Before I could even process the Venmo request fully, a text message from my mom came through. It was the first communication I had received from her since before the accident. It read, "Julie, call me back, it's urgent. We can't fix this without you." Fix what? Fix their financial shortfall. The "this" she was referring to clearly wasn't my fractured arm or my totaled car. It was about the cabin. It was always about the money. The 41 missed calls weren't born of concern for my health. They were calls of collection. They had likely reached the end of their trip, the final bill for the cabin was due, and they had suddenly realized that the family ATM was not dispensing cash. That was the emergency, not my car crash, not my injuries. Their vacation bill was the real crisis. The clarity was blinding. They hadn't called to ask if I was okay. They had called because they needed something. The unspoken contract was back in effect, in their minds at least. It was my turn to pay. I looked at the Venmo request again, $3,100. I looked at my mom's text. "We can't fix this without you." And then I looked at my reflection in the dark screen of the phone, my face pale, a dark bruise blooming on my cheekbone, my arm in a sling. The contrast between their demand and my reality was grotesque, and in that moment, something inside me shifted permanently. The hurt, the sadness, the years of quiet resentment, they all coalesced into a single, unshakable resolve. They wanted me to fix this. They wanted me to chip in. Fine, I would fix it. I would send them a bill of my own. I got angry, yes, but it was a new kind of anger. It was a cold, calculating anger. The anger of a financial analyst who had just discovered a massive, fraudulent discrepancy in the books. And I was about to conduct a full, unforgiving audit of our entire relationship. The weekend was a crucible. While they were presumably packing up from their blissful mountain getaway, I was at my kitchen table, my left arm throbbing in its sling, a laptop open in front of me. Sarah had come over, armed with takeout and a grimly determined expression. "Okay," she said, pulling up a chair. "Operation Payback. What's the plan?" My plan wasn't about shouting or crying or dramatic confrontations. My brain, the one that found clarity in numbers and logic, had already kicked into high gear. The anger was still there, a cold, dense star in my chest, but it was now fueling a meticulous analytical process. They had sent me a bill. I was going to send them one back, an itemized invoice for services rendered. "They see me as a bank," I told Sarah, my voice low and steady. "So, I'm going to act like one. I'm going to calculate the true cost of their neglect. Every penny." For the next 2 days, I didn't rest. I dove into years of my financial history. I pulled up old bank statements, credit card bills, and archived emails. I was no longer Julie, the daughter and sister. I was Julie, the forensic accountant of my own life. Every transaction, every transfer that had propped up their lives was logged into a sprawling spreadsheet. I started with Mark. The gift of the high-end laptop for his music production, $2,800. The studio monitors, $750. The 6 months of rent I'd covered when he first moved out, $7,200. The countless loans for groceries or bills that were never repaid, ranging from $50 to $500. I cross-referenced the dates of these transfers with his social media. The $300 for his electric bill coincided with photos of him and Chloe at a music festival. The $500 for a car repair was sent 2 days before Chloe posted a picture of her new designer handbag. It was a sickening, detailed portrait of my own naivety. The money hadn't been a lifeline. It had been an allowance, funding a lifestyle of leisure and irresponsibility. Then I moved on to my mom. This was harder, emotionally. These transactions were tangled up in the guise of love and filial duty. The times I'd paid her property tax bill because she was a little short, $3,500 twice. The new transmission for her aging car, $4,200. The monthly $300 I sent her for extra expenses, a transfer that had been happening automatically for the last 3 years, totaling $10,800. I remembered the conversations that came with these payments. Her sighs of relief, her promises that she didn't know what she'd do without me. I had believed it was my duty, my way of caring for her. Seeing it all laid out in stark, black and white numbers, it felt different. It felt like enablement. I was the crutch that had kept her from ever learning to stand on her own 2 feet financially. Finally, I tackled the cabin trips. For 5 years, I had footed the majority of the bill. I had the rental agreements and credit card statements to prove it. I calculated the total cost of each trip and subtracted the token amounts my mother had occasionally contributed. My share, the portion I had covered for all of them, came to a staggering $11,400. And this year's $1,500 deposit was the cherry on top. As I added up the columns, the final numbers stared back at me from the screen, cold and unforgiving. The total financial support I had provided to Mark over the last 5 years, not including small, untraceable cash gifts, was $28,650. For my mother, it was $22,300. The grand total, the amount I had poured into this black hole of a family, was over $50,000. The spreadsheet wasn't just a financial record. It was a testament to a decade of one-sided sacrifice. It was the price of the unspoken contract. But the invoice needed more than just the historical data. It needed to include the cost of their most recent and most egregious failure. I added new line items. Cost of medical services not covered by insurance, ER visit, diagnostics, initial treatment. I pulled up my hospital paperwork. My copay and deductible would be around $1,200. Estimated cost of vehicle replacement, deductible and depreciation loss, $3,000. Loss of income due to medically required leave. I calculated my weekly salary, at least $2,500. I was quantifying the tangible consequences of their absence. If they had been there, perhaps some of these logistical and financial burdens would have been easier to bear. But they weren't. This was the cost of their bonfire. This was the price of their good vibes only. Sarah watched me work, her expression a mixture of horror and awe. "Julie, this is clinical," she said softly. "It is," I agreed. "They've treated me like a transaction for years. They've reduced our relationship to dollars and cents. I'm just using their language." When the spreadsheet was complete, I drafted a formal email. The subject line was simple: "Ray, your request for $3,100. I attached the spreadsheet, password protected. I wrote a short, dispassionate message. To Helen Mark. Subject: Ray, your request for $3,100. I have received your request for payment regarding the cabin rental. Before I address it, I ask that you review the attached document, which provides a detailed summary of our financial history over the past 5 years. I have also included a preliminary calculation of the costs I have personally incurred as a direct result of events that transpired on Tuesday evening. The password to open the document is unspoken contract. I believe this summary will provide the necessary context for our future discussions. Regards, Julie. I hovered my mouse over the send button. This was it. This was the point of no return. I was no longer just feeling angry, I was acting on it. I was burning the unspoken contract to the ground and replacing it with a very, very explicit one. I thought of them laughing by the fire, of the empty hospital room, of the audacious Venmo request. I clicked send. And then, for the first time in days, I felt a flicker of something other than pain or anger. It was a sense of control. The ball was in their court now. Let's see how they liked playing by my rules. The silence after I sent the email was different from the silence that had followed my accident. The first had been a silence of neglect, an empty space where concern should have been. This new silence was one of shock, a digital stunned mullet. It lasted for precisely 1 hour and 12 minutes. Then my phone erupted. It was my mother. I ignored the call. A text immediately followed. "What is this, Julie? Is this a joke? Open the document, it's asking for a password." I took a deep breath, my heart hammering against my ribs, and texted back the password, unspoken contract. The reply was almost instantaneous. "This is cruel. Call me right now." Mark was next. His text was less articulate. "WTF is this spreadsheet? Are you serious?" I didn't reply to either of them. I let them stew. I let them sit with the numbers, with the cold, hard evidence of their dependency. For years, they had operated in a comfortable fog of vague promises and unacknowledged debts. I had just turned on a floodlight. The calls and texts kept coming, a frantic barrage of guilt, anger, and disbelief. Helen's messages shifted from demanding to pleading. "Julie, we're family. You can't put a price on family." Mark's were a mix of outrage and victimhood. "So this is what it's about? Money? After all I'm trying to do with my music, you throw this in my face?" Chloe even chimed in from Mark's phone, her voice a shrill intrusion in a voicemail he left on speaker. "This is so toxic, Julie. We were just trying to have a nice trip. A nice trip." The phrase was so ridiculously out of touch with my reality, the cast on my arm, the bruises on my body, the totaled wreck of my car, that I almost laughed. They weren't angry that they had abandoned me. They were angry that I had noticed. They were angry that I had kept receipts. Finally, after 2 hours of this digital siege, I sent a single message to a group chat with my mother and Mark. "I will be at Mom's house tomorrow at noon to discuss this in person. We will settle all outstanding accounts then. Do not contact me again until then." My use of accounts was deliberate. This was a business meeting, the end-of-quarter review for a family that had long been emotionally and financially bankrupt. The next morning, I dressed with purpose. I didn't choose comfortable clothes for my injuries. I put on a crisp blazer over a simple blouse, slacks, and the most professional-looking shoes I could manage. I put my fractured arm in its black sling, a visible, undeniable symbol of their failure. I looked like I was heading to a corporate negotiation, and in a way, I was. Sarah drove me, waiting in the car for backup, as she put it. I walked into my mother's house, and the tension was so thick I could taste it. Helen and Mark were sitting on the living room sofa, looking like they'd been summoned to the principal's office. Mark was sullen, refusing to meet my eyes. Helen's face was pale, her hands twisting a tissue in her lap. Chloe was there too, perched on the arm of the sofa, her arms crossed defensively. Her presence confirmed my suspicions. She was a key stakeholder in this dysfunctional corporation. I didn't sit down. I remained standing, a deliberate power move. I placed a folder on the coffee table. "Thank you for meeting me," I said, my voice as level and devoid of emotion as I could make it. "I received your Venmo request for $3,100. I'm here to address it." "Julie, this is insane," Mark blurted out, his voice cracking. "That spreadsheet, you've been keeping a list. It's called a financial ledger, Mark," I replied coolly. "It's a record of transactions, something you might want to learn about. We were worried about you." Helen cut in, her voice trembling with manufactured hurt. "When we didn't hear from you, we thought you were just busy with work before the trip." The lie was so blatant, so pathetic, it was almost insulting. "Worried?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. "Let's review the timeline. A paramedic from the county EMS called you, Helen. He told you I was in an accident and was being taken to St. Mary's. He called you too, Mark. And what did you do? You packed your bags and drove 3 hours in the other direction to a cabin I paid the deposit on. You were so worried that you posted photos of yourself having a party while I was being diagnosed with a concussion, a broken arm, and 3 cracked ribs. So please, do not use the word worried with me." Silence. Helen's face crumpled. Mark stared at the floor. "The paramedic never said it was that serious," Mark mumbled. "He just said an accident, and your first instinct wasn't to call me back, to check, to go to the hospital." I let the questions hang in the air. "No, your first instinct was to start your vacation early with the real crew, your words, I believe." I looked directly at Chloe, who flinched. I opened the folder on the table. It contained printed copies of the spreadsheet and new documents. "Let's talk about the Venmo request," I continued, my voice all business. "The total cost of the cabin was, I assume, around $3,100, which you now need to pay. However, I already paid a $1,500 deposit, so at most, you would have owed the rental company $1,600. Your request to me for $3,100 implies you wanted me to cover the entire cost of a trip I never went on, while also pocketing my initial deposit. Is that correct?" Mark stammered. "No, the math was, we just figured you'd cover it like always." "Exactly," I said, a grim satisfaction in my voice. "Like always, but the always is over." I pushed a single piece of paper across the table. It was a formal invoice. At the top, in bold letters, it read, "Final invoice for services and DAMAGES." It listed, in clear, itemized lines, "Reimbursement for historical financial support, Mark, $28,650. Reimbursement for historical financial support, Helen, $22,300. Compensation for cabin deposit, 2024, $1,500. Costs incurred due to negligence on 10/26, medical, vehicular, lost wages, $6,700. The total at the bottom was printed in an offensively large font, $59,150. "This is my response to your Venmo request," I stated calmly. "This is the final bill. This is what you owe me." They stared at the paper as if it were a snake. Chloe let out a small, horrified gasp. "You can't be serious," Helen whispered. "Oh, I am," I said. "I am deadly serious. You've been living on a line of credit from the bank of Julie for years. The bank is now closed. The loan is being called in. You can consider the $59,150 a starting point for our negotiations, or you can consider it my final word. Either way, you will not receive another cent from me. Ever. The aftermath of my final invoice was not an explosion, but a slow, crumbling collapse. Mark and Helen stared at the piece of paper, their faces a mixture of shock and utter incomprehension. They had expected me to fold, to eventually give in to the guilt and pressure as I always had. They were not prepared for me to present them with the bill for their own behavior. $59,000, Mark finally choked out, laughing a hollow, desperate laugh. You're insane. We don't have that kind of money, you know that. I do know that, I said, my voice unwavering. I know that because your inability to manage your own finances has been my problem for the last decade, but it's not my problem anymore. It's yours. As for the cabin bill that's so urgent, you have a laptop worth nearly $3,000 and studio equipment worth at least that much. I suggest you start selling. The look of sheer panic on his face was startling. The idea of sacrificing his precious career, tools to pay for his own vacation, was a concept so alien to him, it might as well have been spoken in a different language. My mother, Helen, tried a different tactic. The tears started, the weapon she had wielded with expert precision for years. Julie, how could you do this to us, to your own family, after everything we've been through? The we was what broke the last thread of my composure. What we? I shot back, my voice rising for the first time. What we have been through? We didn't get slammed by an SUV. We weren't lying in a hospital bed alone for hours. I was. And while I was going through that, you were starting a party. So don't you dare talk to me about we. The family you're talking about is a fantasy, and I am no longer willing to fund it. I turned to leave. Chloe, who had been silent until now, stood up. You're just going to walk away? You're ruining their lives over some money? No, I said, pausing at the door and looking back at them, a trio of stunned faces. First, it was never just about the money. The money was a symptom. This is about being left alone in a hospital while my family went on vacation. Second, I'm not ruining their lives. I'm just forcing them to finally start living their own without me as a safety net. You're welcome to step up and take my place. Chloe's mouth snapped shut. The prospect of her influencer income supporting Mark's artist lifestyle was clearly not part of her 5-year plan. I walked out of that house and didn't look back. Sarah was waiting by the car, and I got in, closed the door, and let out a breath I felt like I'd been holding for 10 years. It wasn't a feeling of victory or happiness. It was a feeling of quiet, somber release. It was the feeling of closing a ledger, of balancing a book that had been in the red for far too long. Of course, I never expected them to pay the $59,150. The invoice wasn't a collection tool, it was a declaration of independence. It was a mirror, forcing them to see the true nature of our relationship in the only language they understood, dollars and cents. The weeks that followed were hard. The silence from them was now permanent, a wall I had built myself. There were moments of doubt, late at night, when the old, conditioned guilt would try to creep back in. Was I too harsh? Did I destroy my own family? But then I would look at the still fading bruises on my skin, at the sling holding my arm, and I would remember the bonfire, the smiling faces, and the Venmo request. And the doubt would vanish. I focused on my own recovery. The insurance claim went through, and I used the money, plus some of my own savings that were suddenly much healthier without the constant drain, to buy a new, safer car. Physical therapy was painful but steady, and with each session, I felt myself getting stronger, both physically and emotionally. I reconnected with friends I had neglected because I was always putting my family's manufactured crises first. I started exploring hobbies, things that were just for me, not for anyone else's benefit. I was rediscovering who Julie was without the title of provider attached to her name. About 2 months later, I heard through a mutual acquaintance that Mark and Chloe had broken up. The financial pressure, without me as a buffer, had apparently been too much for their good vibes-only relationship to handle. He had been forced to sell most of his music equipment and move into a smaller apartment with a roommate. My mother, I was told, had to pick up more hours at the library and had taken on a weekend job. They were struggling, but they were surviving, on their own. One evening, I received a short email from my mom. It was the first direct contact since the confrontation. There were no apologies, no excuses. It just said, "I know it's late, but I'm glad you were okay after the accident." It wasn't everything, but it was something. It was an acknowledgement, however small, of the real crisis she had ignored. I didn't reply. It's not a wound that can be healed with a single sentence. I don't know if our relationship will ever be repaired or if I even want it to be. Some things, once broken, can't be put back together in the same way. But I've learned that family isn't an obligation you are born into. It's a relationship you build and maintain through mutual respect, love, and support. My family is Sarah, who sat with me in the hospital and drove me to my confrontation. It's the friends who brought me food and helped me navigate the infuriating maze of insurance claims. My ledger is closed with Helen and Mark. The debt is written off not because it was paid, but because I chose to release it and them from my life. I am no longer their safety net. I am my own. And for the first time, I feel truly, securely, financially, and emotionally solvent.